Imagine a small, dusty town in Africa,
where the sun beats down on cracked earth and the air hums with the quiet struggles of everyday life. The streets are alive with the chatter of vendors, the clatter of bicycles, and the distant laughter of children chasing dreams they can barely afford to have. In this town, where hope and hardship walk hand in hand,
lives a woman named Grace.
She is not the kind of person you would notice at first glance. Her clothes are faded, her hands rough from years of labor, and her eyes carry a weight that speaks of battles fought in silence. But Grace is the heart of this story, and her quiet strength is about to unravel a mystery that will leave even the hardest hearts trembling. Grace works as a cleaner at the grand estate of Mr.
Victor Langston, a man whose name is through the town like a legend.
Victor is everything Grace is not: wealthy, powerful, untouchable. His mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the town, gleams with polished marble and towering gates, a stark contrast to the modest shacks that dot the landscape below. Victor owns half the businesses in town, from the textile factory to the sprawling supermarket that feeds the community. To the townsfolk, he is a king in all but name, a man who holds their livelihoods in his manicured hands. But to Grace, he is just the boss, a distant figure who signs her paycheck and barely glances her way. Every day, Grace sweeps the floors of Victor's offices, dusts his mahogany desks, and polishes the glass that reflects his empire.
She moves like a shadow,
unnoticed but essential, her presence as routine as the sunrise. But there is one thing about Grace that sets her apart, something that has become a quiet rumor among her co-workers. She always asks for leftovers.
At the end of the day,
when the office kitchen is cleared out,
Grace linge by the bain.
Her voice soft but steady as she asks the cooks if there is anything they are throwing out. A half-eaten tray of sandwiches,
a bowl of soup gone cold,
a loaf of bread too stale for the staff. Grace takes it all, carefully wrapping it in a cloth and tucking it into her worn-out bag. She never explains why, and no one asks. They just whisper behind her back, some with pity, others with judgment. She must be starving, they say. Or maybe she is just greedy. Victor, too, has heard the whispers. At first, he dismissed them. Grace was just another worker, one of dozens who kept his world running smoothly. But over time, her habit began to gnaw at him. Why would someone, even someone as poor as Grace, beg for scraps? Was she hoarding food, selling it, or was there something else? Something he could not quite place. Victor prided himself on knowing everything about his business, every deal,
every employé, every detail.
But Grace was a puzzle he could not solve, and that irritated him. It was not just curiosity, it was suspicion. What was she hiding? Was she stealing from him, using his generosity to take advantage? The thought festered, and Victor, a man who thrived on control, decided he needed answers. One humid afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange, Victor made a decision that would change everything. He was in his office, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and the hum of his air conditioner, when he saw Grace through the window. She was leaving the estate.
Her bag slint over her shoulder. Ivier d'inusual.
The sight stirred something in him, part irritation,
par intrigue.
He grabbed his keys, slipped into his sleek black car, and followed her. He told himself it was just to settle his doubts, to catch her in the act of whatever scheme she was running. But deep down, there was something else, a flicker of curiosity about the woman he would barely noticed until now. Grace's path took her away from the polished streets near Victor's estate, down winding dirt roads where the houses grew smaller and the air thicker with the smell of cooking fires. Victor kept his distance, his car creeping along, unnoticed in the dusk. Grace walked with purpose, her steps quick but steady, as if she carried a mission only she understood. She did not look back, did not hesitate, even as the town gave way to a cluster of shanties on the outskirts, where the poorest of the poor scraped by. Victor's car slowed to a crawl. He would never venture this far from his world of wealth, and the sight of the crumbling homes,
the barefooted children playing in the dust,
made his chest tighten. What was Grace doing here? She stopped at a small shack, its walls patched with tin and cardboard, its roof sagging under the weight of time. Victor parked a block away,
hidden in the shadow.
and watched as Grace knocked softly on the door. It creaked open, and a frail figure appeared, a woman. Older, her face lined with exhaustion and illness.
Grace knelt besides her.
Unpacking her bag with care. Victor squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. The older woman's hands trembled as she took the food. Grace offered a loaf of bread, a container of soup, a few bruised apples. They spoke in hushed tones, their words lost in the evening breeze. But the tenderness in Grace's movements was unmistakable. She was not just delivering food. She was giving something deeper. Something that made the older woman's eyes glisten with gratitude. Victor's suspicion began to waver, replaced by a nagging unease. Who was this woman? A relative? A friend? And why was Grace, who could barely afford her own rent, giving away the food she would begged for? He leaned forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel, as Grace stood and hugged the older woman tightly. For a moment, Victor thought he saw Grace wipe her eyes, but the distance made it hard to be sure. She left the shack and continued down the road, her bag lighter now, her steps slower, as if the weight of her own life had settled back onto her shoulders. He followed her again, his mind racing.
The road grew narrower.
The houses sparser, until Grace reached another stop, a tiny yard where a group of children played under a flickering streetlight. They ran to her, their voices bright with excitement, calling her name. Miss Grace. Miss Grace. Victor's breath caught as he watched her kneel again, pulling out more food from her bag. Sandwiches.
A handful of biscuits.
Even a small cake that must have been left from a company meeting.
The children's faces up.
Their laughter cutting through the heavy air. Grace ruffled their hair, her smile warm but ting.
A Victor Langston sat in the shadow.
His sleek black car idling silently, the weight of what he would just witnessed pressed against his chest like a stone. Grace's figure was growing smaller in the distance, her silhouette blending into the twilight as she walked away from the children, her bag now nearly empty. The laughter of the kids still echoed faintly, their joy a stark contrast to the questions swirling in Victor's mind. He would come here expecting to uncover a scheme,
to catch Grace in some act of deceit.
Instead, he would seen her give away everything she would gathered, food she would begged for, scraps she would carried across town, not for herself, but for others. The realization hit him like a wave, stirring something unfamiliar in the man who thought he would seen it all. But this was only the beginning of Grace's story, and the deeper Victor followed, the more he would uncover about her world and his own. Grace's steps were slower now, her shoulders slightly hunched as she made her way down a narrow path lined with overgrown weeds and crumbling fences. Victor hesitated, his fingers hovering over the car's ignition. Part of him wanted to turn back, to retreat to the comfort of his mansion where the world made sense, where people were predictable, and emotions did not complicate his carefully ordered life. But another part of him, a part he barely recognized, urged him to keep going. He needed to know more. Who was Grace, really? Why was she doing this? And what was it about her that made his heart ache in a way he could not explain? He eased the car forward, keeping his distance, the headlights off to avoid drawing attention. The path Grace took led deeper into the town's forgotten edges, where the streetlights grew dimmer and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth and charcoal. Victor had never been this far from the polished center of town, where his businesses thrived and his name commanded respect. This was a different world, one where survival was a daily negotiation, and the people who lived here were invisible to men like him. Yet Grace moved through it with a quiet familiarity, her presence steady and unyielding.
Like a candle burning in the dark.
She stopped at another house, this one even smaller than the last, its walls barely holding together under a patchwork of corrugated metal and wood. Victor parked farther back this time, his car hidden behind a cluster of trees. He watched as Grace knocked gently, her movements deliberate.
Almost rêveur.
The door opened, and a young woman appeared, her face gaunt, her arms wrapped around a toddler who clung to her hip. The child's eyes were wide, curious, but his clothes were threadbare, and his small frame looked too thin for his age. Grace knelt down, her smile soft as she spoke to the boy, her hand brushing his cheek. She reached into her bag, nearly empty now, and pulled out the last of her offerings. a small container of rice and a few pieces of fruit. The young woman's face softened, her eyes filling with tears as she took the food, her lips moving in what Victor could only assume was a whispered thank you. The scene was intimate, private, and Victor felt like an intruder, a voyeur peering into a moment he had no right to witness. Yet he could not look away. Grace's kindness, her quiet selflessness, was unraveling something inside him. He would spend his life building walls between himself and his employees, between his wealth and the poverty that surrounded it, but Grace was tearing those walls down without even knowing it. The young woman hugged her tightly, the toddler giggling as he wrapped his arms around Grace's neck. For a moment, they were a small island of warmth in a world that seemed determined to break them. Grace stood, her bag now completely empty, and said something to the young woman before turning to leave. Victor's heart pounded as he watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller against the horizon. He should have stopped there, should have driven home and let the mystery of Grace remain unsolved. But something compelled him to follow, to see where this path would lead. He started the car again, his movements almost mechanical, as if drawn by a force he could not name. The road ended at a small clearing,
where a single shack stood alone,
its roof sagging and its walls leaning precariously to one side. This, Victor realized, must be Grace's home. It was humbler than any of the places she would visited, a fragile structure that looked like it could collapse in a strong wind. Grace paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame as if gathering herself before stepping inside. Victor parked at a distance, his breath shallow, his mind racing with questions. Why would someone who lived like this, who had so little, give away everything she had? What drove her to carry food across town, to share what little she could scrape together with others who were just as desperate? He waited, expecting her to disappear inside. But instead, Grace emerged a moment later, carrying a small bucket and a rag. She sat on a rickety stool outside the shack, dipping the rag into the bucket and scrubbing a pile of clothes with a quiet intensity.
The moonlight cooked her face,
and Victor saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the kind of weariness that came not just from a long day, but from a long life. Yet there was something else there, too, a determination, a strength that refused to break. She hummed softly as she worked, a melody so faint Victor could barely hear it, but it carried a warmth that made his throat tighten. For the first time, Victor wondered about Grace's life beyond the hours she spent cleaning his offices. Did she have a family?
a husband, children of her own.
Or was she alone in that crumbling shack, fighting a battle no one else could see? The questions gnawed at him, each one chipping away at the image he would build of her, a faceless worker,
A woman who begged for scraps.
She was more than that. He realized now. She was a person, with a story, with pain and purpose he would never bother to understand. Victor's phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him of a late-night meeting with investors. The world of wealth and power felt distant now, almost irrelevant, as he sat watching Grace scrub clothes under the stars. He ignored the message, his eyes fixed on her. He wanted to get out of the car, to walk up to her and ask why she gave so much when she had so little, why she carried this burden alone. But he stayed rooted to his seat, the weight of his own privilege holding him back. He was not ready to face her, not yet. Not when he was still grappling with the shame of his suspicions, the realization that he would judge her without ever knowing her. As Grace finished her washing and hung the clothes on a sagging line, Victor made a decision. He would come back. He would follow her again.
Not out of suspicion,
but out of a need to understand. There was something about her, something in the way she moved. The way she gave that felt like a challenge to everything he thought he knew about the world.
Et started the car, the engine slowly breaking the silence.
And drove away, his mind a tangle of emotions he could not name. Back at his mansion, Victor could not sleep. The opulence of his surroundings, the crystal chandeliers, the imported rugs, the walls lined with art felt hollow.
Almost oppressive.
He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but it tasted bitter, unable to drown out the images of Grace's journey.
The frail woman in the shack.
The children's laughter.
The young mother's tears.
He thought of the food Grace had given away, food he would dismiss as worthless. Scraps from his empire. To him, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. The next day at the office, Victor found himself watching Grace more closely. She moved through her tasks with the same quiet efficiency, her face unreadable, her hands steady as she wiped down desks and emptied bins. But now, Victor saw her differently. He noticed the way her lips pressed together when she thought no one was looking, the way her shoulders tensed when a coworker whispered about her. He overheard one of the cooks muttering to another,
"There she goes again,"
begging for scraps. What does she even do with it all? Victor's jaw tightened. But he said nothing. He was not ready to confront the world he would build. A world where people like Grace were invisible until they became a problem. That evening, he followed her again. This time, he was more careful, parking farther away.
Blending into the dusk.
Grace's routine was the same. She carried her bag,
Heavy with leftover.
and made her way to the same shanties.
The same face.
But tonight, there was a new stop. She approached a small community center, its walls painted with faded murals, its yard filled with people gathered around a fire. Victor watched from a distance as Grace handed out the last of her food, her smile bright but strained. An older man, his face weathered but kind, took her hand and spoke to her, his voice carrying a warmth that made the others nod in agreement. Victor could not hear the words, but he saw the way the group looked at Grace, not with pity, but with respect, with gratitude. It was then that Victor noticed something else.
A small notebook in Grace's hand.
Its pages worn and dog-eared. She opened it, scribbling something quickly before tucking it back into her bag. What was it? A list, a journal, a record of the people she helped. The mystery deepened, and Victor felt a pang of guilt for intruding on her life like this. For turning her kindness into a puzzle he felt entitled to solve. But he could not stop now. He needed to know the full truth, the reason behind her sacrifices, the story that had brought her to this point. As Grace left the community center,
The firelight casting long shadow behind her.
Victor made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow, he would find a way to talk to her not as her boss, but as someone who wanted to understand. He did not know what he would say, or how she would react, but he knew he could not go back to the way things were. Grace's actions had cracked something open inside him, and the man who emerged from that fracture was no longer content to sit on his throne.
Blind to the world.
Below. Victor drove back to his mansion that night, the weight of Grace's words and the community center's warmth lingering like a melody he could not shake. The man who had built an empire on control and calculation was unraveling, his certainty replaced by a hunger to understand not just Grace, but the world she carried on her shoulders. The next morning, Victor woke with a clarity he had not felt in years. His office, with its polished surfaces and sterile air,
Felt like a cage.
he could not sit through another meeting, could not sign another contract, without addressing the truth that had been laid bare before him. Grace was not just a cleaner. She was a lifeline for people he would never bother to see. And he, Victor Langston, had been complicit in their invisibility.
The realization stung.
But it also sparked something new, a resolve to do more than watch from the shadows. He found Grace in the break room again, wiping down tables with that same quiet focus. This time, he did not hesitate. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but softer than his usual commanding tone. She looked up, her eyes wary, the memory of their last conversation still fresh.
"Il met en toi what he said yesterday."
"I want to help. Not just you, but everyone you are helping." Grace paused, her rag still in hand, her expression unreadable.
"Why now, Monsieur Langston?"
She asked, her voice low but firm. "You have never cared before."
The question hit like a blade. Sharp and true.
Victor swallowed, his usual confidence faltering. "You are right," he admitted, the words foreign on his tongue. "I did not see it. I did not see you. But I do now, and I can't unsee it."
"Tell me what you need, Grace."
"Tell me how I can make this easier." For a long moment, Grace said nothing, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a trick. Then she shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips, not mocking, but tired, as if she would heard promises like this before. "It is not about making it easier. Sir, she said. It is about surviving. You can't fix that from up here. She gestured vaguely toward the window, where his mansion loomed on the hill. But if you want to help,
Come see it for yourself.
not from your car, not from a distance. Come where it is real. Her words were a challenge, one Victor had not expected. He nodded, his throat tight. Where, he asked. When? Tonight, Grace said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made Victor pause. At the community center. You will see, Victor nodded, the simplicity of her invitation belying the challenge it held. He spent the rest of the day restless, his mind far from the spreadsheets and emails that usually consumed him. The polished world of his office felt like a facade, a carefully constructed bubble that shielded him from the raw reality Grace navigated every day. When the workday ended, he did not hesitate. He drove to the community center, his car no longer hidden in the shadows but parked boldly in the open, a silent declaration that he was done lurking. The faded murals on the building's walls seemed to pulse with life in the fading light, and the hum of voices inside drew him in like a beacon. Stepping inside, Victor was met with a wave of warmth, literal and figurative. The room was crowded but not chaotic, filled with people of all ages sharing food, stories, and quiet moments of connection. The air carried the scent of stew simmering on a makeshift stove, mingled with the earthy smell of the evening breeze slipping through open windows. Grace was already there, moving through the crowd with her usual quiet purpose. Her bag of leftovers emptied onto a long table covered with a patchwork of cloths. She did not see Victor at first, her attention fixed on a young boy who tugged at her sleeve, his face bright with excitement as he showed her a drawing he would made. Grace knelt beside him, her smile soft but genuine, and Victor felt that now familiar ache in his chest. This was her world, and he was only beginning to understand its depth. Mama Esther, the woman who'd spoken to him the night before, approached, her eyes sharp but warm. You are back, she said, a hint of approval in her voice. Grace did not think you would show up again. I meant it, Victor said, his voice low. I want to help. I want to understand. Mama Esther nodded, gesturing to a chair near the table. Then sit. Watch. Listen. This is not a place for quick fixes or grand gestures. It is a place for being present. Victor sat, his tailored suit out of place among the worn clothes and weathered faces around him. He watched Grace move through the room, her presence a quiet anchor for the people who leaned on her. She handed out bowls of stew, checked on an elderly woman who coughed into a handkerchief, and laughed with a group of teenagers who teased her about her storytelling. Her notebook was in her hand again, and Victor noticed how she jotted down small details, a name.
Anid a promise to follow up.
It was not just a record. It was a testament to her commitment, a map of the lives she held together. Mama Esther sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. You asked about Grace's mother last night, she said, her voice soft but deliberate. Sarah's been sick for years. Cancer. The kind that eats away at you slowly, takes everything you have. Grace was just a girl when it started.
Barely out of school.
She wanted to be a teacher, you know. Had dreams of standing in a classroom.
Shaping humans.
But when Sarah got sick, those dreams got buried under hospital bills and promises that never came through. Victor's throat tightened. He thought of Grace's shack, the sagging roof, the bucket of clothes she would scrubbed under the moonlight. Why did not she tell anyone? He asked. She works for me. I could have. Could have what?
Mama Esther interrupted.
Her tone gentle but firm. Given her a raise, paid for a doctor. Grace does not trust charity. Not from people like you. She has seen too many promises broken. Too many hands offered only to pull back when it gets hard. She carries this because she knows no one else will. Victor's hands clenched in his lap, the truth of her words cutting deep. He would build his empire on deals and contracts, on trust backed by signatures and numbers. But Grace's world was built on something else, on love, on sacrifice, on a stubborn refusal to let go of those who depended on her. He looked at her now, helping a young mother cut up food for her toddler, and saw not just a cleaner, but a woman who carried a community on her shoulders. Grace finally noticed him, her eyes widening briefly before she masked her surprise with a nod. She approached, her notebook tucked under her arm, her expression cautious but not hostile. "You came again," she said, her voice neutral but curious. "You asked me to," Victor replied, managing a small smile. "I am here to learn, Grace. To see what you see." She studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing but not unkind. "This is not a place for watching," she said. "It is a place for doing. If you want to understand, you have to be part of it." She handed him a ladle, her gesture simple but heavy with meaning. Victor took it, his hands unsteady, and stepped toward the table. The people around him did not stare or whisper, they just nodded, accepting his presence as if it were natural. He served stew, his movements awkward at first, but as he listened to their stories, a father who'd lost his job, a grandmother raising her grandchildren alone, a girl who dreamed of becoming a nurse, he found a rhythm. Each face, each voice, was a piece of the world Grace had opened to him, a world he would ignored for too long. As the night wore on, Victor felt something shift inside him. It was not just guilt or pity, it was a longing to belong to something bigger than himself, to be more than the man who sat on a hill,
distant and intouchable.
He glanced at Grace, who was now sitting with a group of children, her notebook open as she wrote down their names, their needs. He realized then that her strength was not in her silence, but in her choice to keep going, to keep giving, even when the world gave her nothing back. When the evening ended, Grace walked him to the door,
Her expression softened now,
though still guarded. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "For being here. I will keep coming," Victor said, and this time, it was not just a promise, it was a commitment. "But I need to know, Grace. Why do you do it? Why give everything when you have so little?" Grace looked at him, her eyes steady, and for the first time, she let the wall drop just a fraction. "Because I know what it is like to have nothing," she said. "When I was a kid, my mother went hungry so I could eat. She gave up everything for me. Now it is my turn. For her. For them." She gestured to the room, to the people who were now cleaning up.
Logging, leaving.
"It is not about me. It is about them," Victor nodded, her words sinking into him like rain into parched earth. He drove home that night,
The star bright above the town.
and for the first time, he did not feel alone in his mansion. He felt connected not just to Grace, but to the people she cared for, to the community he would been blind to for so long. The next day, Victor did something he would never done before. He called a meeting with his senior staff, but not to discuss profits or expansion. He told them about Grace, not her name, not her story, but the idea of her.
A woman who gave everything.
Who carried a community while asking for nothing. He proposed changes, better wages for the cleaning staff, a fund for medical emergencies, a program to donate surplus food from his businesses to the community center. The room was silent at first, the executives exchanging glances, but Victor did not care. This was not about their approval. It was about doing what was right. He found Grace later, in the hallway, her mop in hand. "I am starting something," he said, his voice steady. "A way to help, not just you, but everyone.
Food, medical care.
Support for the community center. I want you to be part of it."
Grace.
Not as a cleaner, but as someone who knows what they need. Grace looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and skepticism. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why now?" "Because you showed me," Victor said simply. "You showed me what matters." For a moment, Grace did not speak, her eyes searching his face. Then she nodded, a small gesture that felt like a bridge between their worlds. "I will think about it," she said, and turned back to her work. Victor did not push her. He knew trust was not given easily, especially not by someone like Grace,
who'd been let down by the world too many times.
But as he walked away, he felt a spark of hope, a hope that he could be more than the man he would been, that he could build something that mattered, not just for himself, but for the people Grace had taught him to see. The story was not over. There was one final truth about Grace. A revelation that would shake Victor to his core and bring him to tears. But for now, he was content to take the first steps. To walk beside her, to learn from a woman who'd given him more than she would ever know. Victor's journey into Grace's world had already changed him, but the deepest revelation was yet to come. Over the next few weeks, he kept his promise, returning to the community center, serving food, listening to stories,
and slowly earning the trust of the people there.
Grace remained cautious, but she began to share more. Small glimpses into her life that painted a picture of resilience and sacrifice. Victor learned about her mother's illness, the years of struggle, the dreams Grace had buried to keep her family afloat. Each conversation was a step closer to understanding, but also a reminder of how much he would missed, how blind he would been. One evening, as the community center emptied and the stars began to speckle the sky, Grace asked Victor to walk with her. They left the center, her steps leading them down a familiar path toward the shack where her mother lived. Victor's heart pounded, sensing this was different, that Grace was about to reveal something she would kept hidden even from Mama Esther. They reached the shack, its walls still patched and sagging, and Grace paused at the door, her hand trembling slightly. "There is something you need to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About why I do this. Why I can't stop." Victor nodded, his breath shallow, bracing himself for whatever came next. Grace opened the door, and inside, Sarah lay on a thin mattress, her frail frame barely visible under a worn blanket. But there was something else, something Victor had not noticed before.
A small photograph on the wall.
Faded but clear, showing a young Grace with a boy, no older than 10, his smile bright and familiar. Victor's eyes widened as he recognized the face not just from the photo, but from a memory buried deep in his past. "That is my brother, Samuel," Grace said, her voice breaking. "He died when I was 16. He was sick, like Mama, but we could not afford the medicine. I promised him I would never let anyone else go through that, not if I could help it. That is why I take the food."
Why he give it away?
"Because I could not save him."
Victor's vision blurred.
Tears stinging his eyes. He remembered now a boy, years ago, who'd worked odd jobs at his factory.
Always smiling, always kind.
Victor had barely known him, had dismissed his absence when he stopped showing up. He had not known about the illness, the poverty, the sister who'd carried the guilt of his loss for years. Grace's sacrifice was not just for her mother, or the community, it was for Samuel, for a promise she would made to a boy who'd never grow up. "I am so sorry," Victor whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached for Grace's hand, but she stepped back, her eyes glistening but resolute. "Don't be sorry," she said.
Just do better.
For them. She gestured to the world outside, to the people she carried in her heart. Victor nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. He thought of his wealth, his power, the years he would spend building an empire while people like Grace and Samuel fought to survive. He would been blind, but now he saw not just Grace's pain, but her strength, her love, her unyielding commitment to a promise that defined her. From that day forward,
Victor changed.
He did not just fund the community center. He became part of it, working alongside Grace, learning from her, building a bridge between his world and hers. The food donation program grew.
The medical fund saved lives.
And Grace, though still cautious, began to trust him not as a boss, but as a partner in something bigger. The town began to change too, as Victor's businesses shifted, prioritizing people over profits, creating jobs, offering support where there had once been indifference. But the greatest change was in Victor himself. He would. Her words were a call to action, a challenge that went beyond donations or programs. Victor understood now that this was not about fixing a single life. It was about changing a system, a mindset, a way of living that had allowed him to thrive while others struggled. He thought of his mansion, his businesses, the wealth he would taken for granted, and realized that none of it meant anything if it did not serve the people who made it possible, the workers, the cleaners, the invisible hands like Grace's that kept his world turning. Over the next few weeks, Victor threw himself into the work. He returned to the community center night after night. Not as a benefactor, but as a participant. Serving food, listening to stories, learning names. He met the young mother Grace had helped, whose toddler now had a brighter smile thanks to the medical fund Victor had set up. He met the elderly man who'd lost his home but found a family in the center, thanks to Grace's quiet insistence that no one be left behind. And he met the children. Their laughter a reminder of Samuel, of the dreams that could still be nurtured if someone cared enough to try. Grace began to open up, bit by bit, sharing more of her story. Victor learned about the years after Samuel's death. How she would dropped out of school to care for her mother. How she would taken any job she could find to keep them afloat. She spoke of the community center as her lifeline, a place where she would found purpose, where she could honor Samuel's memory by helping others. Her notebook, Victor discovered, was not just a list, it was a chronicle of lives, a record of every person she would fed, every need she would met, every promise she would kept. It was her way of making sure no one else slipped through the cracks, the way Samuel had. Victor's changes went beyond the community center. At his businesses, he implemented new policies: higher wages for low-level staff, health benefits for part-time workers, a partnership with local clinics to provide care for those who could not afford it. He faced resistance, of course, executives who grumbled about costs, investors who questioned his priorities, but Victor did not waver. He would seen too much, felt too much, to go back to the man he would been. And every time he doubted himself, he thought of Grace, of her quiet strength, her unyielding commitment to a promise made to a brother long gone. One evening, as the community center bustled with its usual warmth, Victor pulled Grace aside. The stars were bright outside.
The Hercules the promise refrain.
I have been thinking, he said, his voice steady but tinged with a vulnerability that felt new to him. I want to do more. Not just here, but everywhere. I want to start a foundation. Something that can reach people like you, like Samuel, before it is too late. But I can't do it without you.
Grace. You know this world better than ye ever will.
Grace stood quietly, her arms crossed.
The notebook still tucked under one elbow.
The flicker of firelight from the community center's yard cast shadows across her face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion and resilience etched there. She did not respond immediately, and Victor felt a pang of doubt. Had he overstepped? Was she still skeptical of his intentions? Wary of promises from a man who'd once seen her as little more than a problem to solve. But then her eyes met his.
Steady and searching.
And he saw something shift, a crack in the armor she would worn for so long. A foundation, she said finally, her voice soft but curious, like she was testing the weight of the idea. What would it do? Victor took a deep breath, the words spilling out with a conviction he had not known he possessed. Whatever it needs to.
Food for the hungry, medicine for the sick.
Scholarships for kids who dream like you did. Jobs for people who've been overlooked. A way to make sure no one has to beg for scraps. No one has to lose a brother because they could not afford a doctor.
I want it to be real. Grace not a show, not a way to make myself feel better.
And I want you to help me run it. Not as my employee, but as my partner.
The word partner hung in the air.
Heavy with meaning. Victor had not planned to say it, but it felt right, a recognition of Grace's strength. Her knowledge, her heart. She blinked, her expression softening, but there was still a trace of caution in her eyes. A reminder of the years she would spent guarding herself against broken promises. You are serious, she said. Not a question, but a realization.
Her voice barely above a whisper.
I have never been more serious. Victor replied, his gaze steady. You showed me what matters.
Grace.
You showed me what I have been missing all these years. Let me help you carry it. For a long moment, Grace did not speak, her eyes searching his face as if looking for the man who'd followed her in secret, who'd judged her without knowing her. Then slowly, she nodded, a small gesture that felt like a seismic shift. All right, she said, her voice firm but soft. But we do it my way. No fancy offices. No big speeches. Just real help. For real people. Victor let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a smile breaking across his face. Your way, he agreed, the words carrying a promise. Always, the weeks that followed were a blur of action. Victor and Grace worked side by side, laying the groundwork for what would become Samuel's promise, a foundation named for the brother whose loss had shaped Grace's life. It was not easy. There were late nights, heated debates, moments when Grace's pragmatism clashed with Victor's ambition. But through it all, there was a shared purpose, a quiet understanding that grew between them. Grace brought her notebook, her chronicle of lives, to every meeting, ensuring that every decision was grounded in the needs of the people she would spend years serving. Victor brought his resources, his connections, his determination to make amends for the years he would looked away. The foundation took shape quickly. They partnered with local clinics to provide free medical care, set up a food distribution network that turned Victor's surplus into sustenance for hundreds, and launched a scholarship program for children who, like Grace once had, dreamed of a future beyond their circumstances. The community center became the foundation's heart, its faded murals repainted by volunteers, its tables filled with food and laughter.
Sarah, Grace's mother,
was moved to a better facility, her treatment funded by the foundation. And though her illness was still a shadow, she lived to see her daughter's work grow into something bigger than either of them had imagined. Grace herself began to change, though subtly. The guardedness in her eyes softened, replaced by a quiet confidence as she stepped into her role. She was not just the woman who begged for leftovers anymore. She was a leader, a voice for the voiceless.
A bridge between the world of the chantier and the world of wealth.
Yet she never lost her humility, her insistence on keeping things real. When Victor suggested a grand opening ceremony for the foundation,
Grace shook her head.
No cameras, she said. No speeches.
Just open the doors and let people come.
And they did. The community poured in, mothers with babies on their hips, elders with stories to tell, children with dreams that now had a chance to take root. Victor watched from the sidelines, no longer the center of attention, but content to be a part of something greater. He saw the young mother whose toddler he would serve stew to, now training to be a nurse through the foundation's program. He saw the elderly man who'd lost his home, now helping to build new ones for others. And he saw Grace, moving through the crowd with her notebook, still writing, still keeping her promises. One evening, months after that first night in Sarah's shack,
Victor and Grace sat outside the community center. The air cool and the star bright above.
The foundation was thriving, but Victor knew there was one more thing he needed to say. He turned to Grace, his voice steady but filled with a warmth that had grown over the months they would work together. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of his transformation. "You did not just change me,
Grace. You changed everything, how we see the world, how we see myself.
I thought I was coming to solve a mystery, but you showed me a truth I did not know I needed." Grace looked at him, her notebook resting in her lap, the pages worn but filled with the names and stories of the people she would carried for so long.
The starlight cocked her eyes.
And for the first time, Victor saw not just strength, but peace, a quiet acceptance that her work, her promise to Samuel, had grown into something that would outlast her. "You do not owe me anything," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You showed up. You stayed. That is more than most would do." Victor shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It is not enough," he said.
It will never be enough.
But I will keep trying.
Grace. For Samuel. For your mother.
For all of them. And for you. Grace's smile was small but genuine.
A rare glimpse of the woman behind the mission.
"You are doing all right, Mr. Langston," she said, her tone teasing but warm.
For a man who said to think leftover were trash.
They laughed together, the sound blending with the hum of the community center behind them,
where voices and footsteps carry the rhythm of a community reborn.
The town had changed in ways Victor could never have imagined when he would first followed Grace through its dusty streets. The shanties on the outskirts were no longer just crumbling shelters. They were homes with new roofs, new hope, built by hands that had once known only struggle. The children who'd clung to Grace's legs now carried books, their dreams nurtured by scholarships from Samuel's promise.
The community center. once a fading beacon,
was now a hub of life. Its walls bright with fresh paint. Its tables heavy with food shared by many.
Sarah, Grace's mother,
had lived long enough to see her daughter's vision take root. Though her illness still lingered, she spent her days surrounded by love. Her frail hands often holding Grace's as they spoke of Samuel, of the past, and of the future. Victor had visited her many times, sitting quietly as she told stories of Grace as a child, of Samuel's laughter, of a family that had faced loss but never stopped loving. Each visit was a reminder of why he would changed, why he could not go back to the man he would been.
The foundation, Samuel's promise,
had grown beyond the town, its reach spreading to neighboring communities, each one touched by Grace's vision and Victor's commitment. It was not perfect, there were setbacks, arguments, moments when the weight of the work felt overwhelming, but it was real. It was built on the truth Grace had shown Victor, that kindness is not about grand gestures or wealth, but about seeing people, listening to them, and choosing to act.
no matter how small the step.
As they sat under the stars, Victor felt a quiet certainty settle over him. He would spend his life chasing power, building an empire that left him empty. But here, in this moment, with Grace beside him and the community center alive with hope, he felt full not of pride or achievement, but of purpose. He thought of the night he would stood in Sarah's shack, tears streaming down his face as Grace spoke of Samuel. That was the moment everything had changed, the moment he would see not just her pain, but her strength, her love, her unwavering promise to a brother she would lost. It was the moment he would realize that the smallest acts, a loaf of bread, a shared meal, a promise kept, could ripple outward.
Changing lives, changing worlds.
Grace stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, her notebook tucked under her arm. Time to go, she said.
Nodding towards the center.
There is still work to do. Victor rose, following her lead as he always did now. Always, he said, his voice light but sincere. Lead the way, Grace, as they walked back into the community center, the stars shining above and the laughter of children echoing around them. Victor knew this was not the end of their story, but a new beginning. Grace had shown him that true wealth was not in what you owned, but in what you gave. And together, they would keep giving, keep building, keep honoring the promise that had brought them here, a promise born from a boy's smile.
A sister's love, and a man's awakening.
The story of Grace and Victor was not just theirs, it was a call to everyone who heard it. Don't judge by appearances.
Don't assume you know Simeon's story. Look closer, listen deeper.
And act with kindness. Because even the smallest gesture can change a life. Grace's leftovers had fed a community. Her promise had rebuilt a town.
And Victor, once blind,
had learned to see, not just with his eyes, but with his heart. So, as you watch this story unfold,
ask yourself, who is the Grace in your life?
Who is the person you have overlooked?
The one carrying a burden you can't see.
And what can you do today, right now, to make a difference? Because in the end, it is not the wealth you have,
but the love you give,
that changes the world.